Okay, so this diagram that we just went over is talking about how the nutrients that we eat are absorbed into our body's tissues, how these nutrients are first absorbed into the blood, then these nutrients travel into the liver, into the muscle, into the fat tissue, and also into all of the rest of the tissues and how they are absorbed. Okay, now we're going to talk about how these nutrients can be released and used by these body tissues. So going to the next diagram, and here's a diagram showing this, how these nutrients, it's called the post-absorptive state. The energy needs are met by the fuels already in the body. So pre-absorptive state, this is called the absorptive state. This is where the glucose is readily available, and this is how the nutrients are absorbed into the body from the gastrointestinal tract. Now we're going to talk about how the nutrients are already in the body. They're called the fuels that are already in the body, how they can be used to meet our energy needs. Okay, so here's what we have. We're going to start with number one. Okay, and this is liver glycogen, the storage of the glucose. Glycogen will be converted to the glucose through the process of glycogenolysis. That glucose will be placed into the bloodstream. Okay, that glucose can actually reach the brain. The brain cells will absorb glucose and make energy inside of those neuron cells. Okay, the glucose that's released from the liver will only be used by the brain cells directly. Okay. Number two, where's our number two? Okay, muscle glycogen. Muscle glycogen is also storage of glucose. It can be converted through a series of reactions into the energy directly in the muscle. So the muscle will receive energy directly because muscle is very active. And it also be converted to the lactic acid at the same time as the energy is produced. So this process is not as smooth as the production of the energy from the glucose. It also produces lactic acid. That lactic acid is technically a byproduct of the muscle metabolism. If you ever heard of the lactic acid buildup in a very active muscle that's been active for a long time after like the exercise, it can cause like muscle cramps, and it does need to be removed from the muscle through the bloodstream. That lactic acid, however, is not an entirely a waste product in the body, and after it's absorbed into the blood, it's going to be carried through the bloodstream to the heart muscle, and in the heart muscle, the lactic acid can be used to make energy. That is important for the cardiac muscle cells. The lactic acid will also travel through the bloodstream and be absorbed by the liver. And in the liver, the lactic acid will be converted to the glucose, very useful fuel that will be placed back into the bloodstream and become available to the brain for the making of the energy. How cool is that? Okay. Number three, the fat in the fat tissue, the triglycerides. The triglycerides will be split into the glycerol and the fatty acids through the process of lipolysis. The glycerol will travel into the bloodstream and be delivered to the liver. In the liver, the glycerol will be converted to the glucose through the process of gluconeogenesis. That glucose will be used by the brain cells to make energy. Okay. The fatty acids will also be taken up by the liver and converted into the energy that is needed for hepatocytes themselves. These cells also need energy. And the byproduct of this process of converting fatty acids into the energy in the liver produces ketone bodies. Okay, ketone bodies are useful chemicals. These ketone bodies are going to be absorbed by the bloodstream and delivered to the heart muscle, where they're going to be used for energy that keeps the heart beating. In addition, ketone bodies can be absorbed by all other body tissues to make energy the same way the heart muscle makes this energy. Finally, ketone bodies can be also used by the brain cells, by the neurons, in the case of starvation. So if there's no glucose available to the brain at all, okay, there's no more glycogen that comes from the muscle or from the liver, The ketone bodies can be used by the brain in the case of starvation, not receiving glucose from the food, running out of glycogen in the muscle and liver. The ketone bodies can be used by the brain cells, by the neurons, to make energy. Okay. The fatty acids can also be absorbed by the heart muscle themselves, the heart muscle cells, to make energy. The fatty acids can also be absorbed by all other tissues to make energy. And then the fatty acids can be absorbed by the muscle. This is all about skeletal muscle cell to make energy. So when we eat triglycerides first get stored as fat in the when we eat triglycerides, they're broken down into the fatty acids and glycerol, absorbed by the bloodstream by special chylomicrons and converted into fat. But they can also be used for, the fatty acids can also be used for production of energy in every single body cell, including the brain. But the brain cannot receive fatty acids directly. The fatty acids need to be converted to ketone bodies and then used by the brain cells. So it's a little bit of a slower process than the glucose. The fatty acids cannot be used by the brain directly. They first need to be converted by the liver into the ketone bodies and then used by the brain. Okay. Number 4. Okay. So the proteins in the all body's tissues can also be broken down into the amino acids. These amino acids are placed in the bloodstream, and these amino acids will travel through the bloodstream to the liver. So the proteins can also be converted into the energy. So the proteins of our body, for example, even the protein in the muscle myosin, or so muscle proteins, number 4 again, can be broken down into amino acids. That happens during fasting. That means not eating for a prolonged period of time, or starvation. So we're not eating food. Our body can kind of like break itself down. And of course, if we have fat, the fat will be burned, but also the proteins in the muscle, in the skin, in the bones even, will be burned converted into amino acids first, then placed into the bloodstream. Okay, these amino acids will first go through the liver to make energy for the liver itself, and also converted into keto acids, then into glucose. So amino acids in the liver will be converted to the glucose, and then placed into the bloodstream and become available to body's tissues, such as the brain, okay, for making of the energy. Okay. Glucose can also be stored again for the glycogen. Okay. So when our body is starving, it can use its fat reserves or protein reserves to break them down into their constituents. Fats will be broken down into glycerol and fatty acids. They will have to go through the liver first in order to make glucose or ketone bodies. Glucose is made from glycerol. It's going to be an energy source for our brain primarily. Fatty acids will be broken down into ketone bodies and used by the tissues, as well as fatty acids can be used by the tissues directly to make energy. And proteins also have to go through the liver in order for them to become glucose and then used for energy. So proteins cannot be used as energy directly. They have to be broken down into amino acids first and then go through the liver, converted into the glucose, and then that's going to be used for energy. Number 5, we went over that. This is a conversion of amino acids or glycerol into glucose called gluconeogenesis. Lactic acid converted to glucose is also gluconeogenesis. So number 5 shows the gluconeogenesis as well as number 1. Gluconeogenesis is number 5. Number 1 is glycolysis, the lysine splitting of the glycogen into glucose. Number 6 is using fatty acids to make energy. So number 6, fatty acids used to make energy. Fatty acids are used to make energy. Number 7, lactic acid. Lactic acid can be converted into energy by certain body cells, for example, heart muscle. Number 8 is the using of the amino acids to make energy. Only liver can do that. The rest of the body cells will need to receive glucose, so amino acids will need to be converted into the glucose first. And that's going to be it for this diagram. It's a little bit of a complicated diagram, but if you keep going over this diagram and kind of like memorizing the three important things. So glucose is kind of like the most efficient fast fuel. It can be converted into energy by all of our body cells, but primarily the brain uses glucose as a form of energy. Okay. The fat and proteins can also be used as a form of energy. Fats need to be broken down into glycerol and fatty acids. Fatty acids can be used directly to make energy by some of the body cells, but in order for the brain to receive energy from the fatty acids, either glycerol or fatty acids, they need to be converted into the ketone bodies, the fatty acids, for the brain to use, or glycerol needs to be converted to the glucose by the liver for the brain in order for it to make energy. Okay, so fat is not as a quick of a source of energy for our brain because those molecules have to pass through the liver in order to be converted into the molecules useful for the brain in order for it to become energy. Proteins can also be used by the brain to make energy, but first proteins need to be converted into amino acids. Amino acids need to be converted into the glucose by the liver, and that glucose will become available to the brain. So liver is an organ that is 100% essential to our body. Liver failure produces the inability for our body to extract energy from organic molecules in order for the brain to receive these two essential molecules called glucose and ketone bodies in order to make energy. And brain cannot function without energy. So glucose alone is not enough for the brain to function because we need to constantly eat. There's of course many more functions to the liver than just the metabolism. Liver also cleans blood from the toxic waste, and that's going to be poisonous to the body, of course, if the liver fails. So you can look over all of these summary. Okay, so during fasting or starvation, the body must make metabolic changes to survive. So this is what we were just talking about. Fasting is going without a food for several hours or a few days, and starvation is going without food or insufficient amount of food, so inadequate food intake for weeks or months. Okay, so the most dramatic metabolic change occurs with fasting and starvation is an increase in the production of ketone bodies. So ketone bodies are always produced in our bodies, but during the starvation or fasting, and actually we do fasting at night, so when we're sleeping, there's going to be ketone bodies produced because the catabolism of fatty acids increases. So we actually do burn fat in our sleep, even though we're not really doing much, just kind of laying there and breathing, and that definitely burns fat. Ketone bodies may be used for energy by all cells, but once they are produced by the liver. So ketone bodies are produced by the liver as a result of metabolism that happens in the liver. So if you want to refresh your memory, this is ketone bodies. They are produced by the liver from the fatty acids, and fatty acids have to come from the bloodstream. These fatty acids are released from the triglycerides in the fat tissue. So that burns fat.